Very good. I think we are ready to start our session, our sixth session in our special series here at the EGPP on the impact of the war in Ukraine on Europe, on the European Union, and on European integration. And today's session is on migration, on borders, on refugees. It's a very important session, and I'm very happy that it is going to be introduced by Jelena Dzankic and Martin Ruhs of the Migration Policy Center. Thank you very much for being with us today. So Martin Ruhs is in the room here in Villa Schifanoia, and Jelena is online. Welcome to both. I'm delighted also that we are able to organize these seminars across the different units of the Schuman Center. And as I said, this is the sixth session that we have today on different policy areas that are affected by the war in Ukraine. We are in hybrid mode. The session will be introduced first by Martin Ruhs and then by Jelena Dzankic, and then we will go to Q&A and to the general discussion, alternating questions and comments from the people attending in the room and the people online. I think we are ready to give you the floor. Martin, if you like to start. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniele, and for inviting me, and thanks to the EPTG team for organizing this. Thanks for joining us, everybody here in the room and online. I will use the time that I have to reflect a little bit on what Europe's response to refugees from Ukraine might mean for future policy and research. And when I mean what might it mean for future policy, I mean what might it mean for policies towards refugees from other parts of the world. And when I say what does it mean for research is I mean, what questions does it raise? What new questions does it raise? And to what extent, if at all, does it challenge existing research and what we think we know about the politics of asylum and refugee protection, and also public attitudes and preferences? And I will, since these are meant to be introductory remarks, I'll give you a mix of policy background and some relevant research. So what I want to do is basically talk a little bit about policy and some of the research on asylum issues just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, then go briefly over the response that we've seen, in particular the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, and then talk about the future, asking whether or not we are actually experiencing a fundamental policy shift and what the new questions might be. But I was thinking, just in terms of the context, I mean, some of these issues might be very basic, but I think it's good to rehearse them and go through them. I think one thing to keep in mind that when we talk about refugee protection in Europe, we're basically talking about a protection system that provides a protection through the asylum process and not in a big way through resettlement. So as you know, the big difference being that with asylum, people come to a country and make an application for asylum. That application is being assessed, can be accepted or rejected. Resettlement, in contrast, refers to the resettlement of people in third countries whose refugee status has already been recognized. Okay, so we're moving people from first countries of asylum, for example, directly to Europe. What you can see here in Europe, resettlement is less than 2% of total asylum. So this is different for some other countries. If you think about the US or Canada or Australia, resettlement share is much higher. And I do think this is an important aspect of the context that matters for the politics of the process. Now, one thing with a couple of points on asylum applications. Now, the first point and the first difference to resettlement is obviously that asylum applications are very volatile, because there's not meant to be a limit. With resettlement, countries are able to determine how many people they want to resettle. With asylum, by definition, the numbers are not meant to be controlled. So you have volatility, as you can see here. And the second aspect of it is the asylum system is inevitably associated with irregular migration. And I just want to specify what I mean by that is that the Geneva Convention requires countries to examine applications for asylum of people on their territories. The Geneva Convention does not require the issuing of visas for people to travel across countries. Actually, as I'll say a little bit later, most countries, most high-income countries, have made it very difficult for people to reach their territory to claim asylum. So therefore, most people have to cross borders illegally in order to reach countries where they want to claim asylum. If you look at this chart, you see, again, this is well known, that we have a big peak during the refugee protection crisis, 2015 and 16. The other important, I think, feature of the asylum system in Europe is that we have high rejection rates. So these two lines show you positive asylum decisions. So people given some sort of refugee status, either Geneva status or subsidiary protection status, and rejected asylum applications. So, you know, at the moment, in recent years, acceptance rates have been way under half in Europe. So most people who apply for asylum are rejected. Some are allowed to stay on humanitarian grounds because of non-refoulement. They can't go back because it's dangerous to send them back. But many of the rejected asylum seekers do receive what's called return orders. So they're meant to leave. And the final contextual point, I think, which is critical, is that return rates in Europe of people who are meant to return have been very low. So Europe, I think return rates currently are only about one third. So of all the people who've been ordered to leave because they don't have status, only about a third are actually being returned. And there's multiple reasons for that we can go in later. But I think this is very important to understand. We have an asylum system rather than resettlement. Numbers are volatile. There's big debates about the deservingness of people who come in because you have an asylum system. There's an assessment process. There's a debate to what extent that they're deserving of protection rather than motivated by labor migration reasons. And you have very low return rates. So I think this kind of frames the discussion of the politics of the issue. Now, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what was roughly what were the debates and what were the politics? I mean, this is very broad brush, so the purists should look away. But basically, many European countries tried their hardest to reduce the number of asylum seekers coming to their territory, precisely because there's been an increase, there's great volatility, there's great debates about deservingness. And there's been an emphasis on containment, so on trying to keep refugees and asylum seekers outside Europe in first countries of asylum. This has been done through enhanced border controls, visa restrictions, a number of externalization policies, and a real focus, a political focus on return and readmission. So this issue that the return rates are only about one third is a real political issue in many countries. And there's multiple initiatives underway to try to increase these return rates, not least through cooperation with non-EU countries. And I'll get to that in a minute. We have what I've put in quotation mark, financial assistance for migrants, countries of origin and transit. So a real emphasis on trying to assist migrants outside Europe. For those of you who have read Paul Colley and Alex Betz's book on refuge, that's very much the approach that's advocated there. But of course, how you look at this depends on the point of view. Some of this money, of course, is also used to pay for transit countries to make it more difficult for migrants to reach Europe. The EU has approached this, used what they call this global approach to migration since the mid-2000s. And basically that means cooperation with non-EU countries to basically the basis of the cooperation is Europe sends money and in return the non-EU country protects migrants where they are and prevents migrants from coming to Europe. That's the basic exchange, and that has been emphasized and is being more emphasized in recent years. And of course, within Europe, we had a system for intra-EU cooperation for distributing asylum seekers, which basically said that people need to apply for asylum where they first arrive. So it greatly disadvantaged countries who are on the periphery of Europe. Now, of course, with the 2015-16 refugee protection crisis, the Syrian crisis, as you've seen, numbers spiked. Some countries have become much more concerned about asylum. Austria, where I'm from, has essentially adopted a zero asylum policy, more or less explicitly, trying to get numbers down. Resettlement in some countries there's also been pressure on reducing resettlement even further. As we all know, the Dublin system collapsed, so this intra-EU cooperation, and has not been replaced by anything else yet. There's been debates about how to distribute refugees within the EU, largely unsuccessful. There's been emphasis on increasing border controls, more externalization, and we've seen increasing pushbacks as well. Now, the most successful in a way, or maybe successful is the wrong word, the most well-established cooperation between the EU and non-EU is, of course, the EU-Turkey migration deal that was struck. And in a way, that is being credited with reducing numbers of asylum seekers and irregular migrants coming to Europe. And there's a lot of debate about, of course, specific features of that deal. But basically what Europe is trying to do is replicate these kinds of deals with African countries. And most recently, in 2020, we had a new pact on migration and asylum, which if you read it, it kind of, I think, explains and illustrates all the issues and all the roadblocks on how to reform Europe's asylum policy. There's been essentially no progress as far as I can see. This is largely stalled. So if you kind of look at this, so this is all before, the picture is not particularly positive for European policy making. If you look at this history of policies, you wouldn't think that there's much realistic hope for great solidarity within EU in terms of cooperation, but also in terms of making big progress about how to reform the system. Now, of course, the numbers, particularly in 2015, has encouraged a lot of new research. I won't go through in it. A lot of people here in the room and at the EUI have contributed to that research. But we know that immigration asylum issues have become highly politicized, polarizing public discourse, rising numbers of increased salience, contributed to anti-immigration populist parties. We have few papers now that look at how exposure to refugees impacts local residents' views towards refugees, and also on what it does to voting for right-wing parties. And I think one result that might sound very basic, but I think it's very important, is that one real important factor in terms of public attitudes to asylum seekers is the perceived deservingness. So to what extent are people perceived as deserving of protection? That is obviously a big determinant of how they're thought of by Europeans. I won't go through the research. There's a very well-known paper by Dzankic et al. in 2016. These are conjoint experiments that basically, this particular paper looked at, how do personal characteristics of asylum seekers influence Europeans, the probability that Europeans accept asylum seekers. So what increases support for accepting asylum seekers and what decreases support? And what it shows, again, as I said, is that deservingness matters. So kind of major inconsistencies in asylum testimonies reduce support. Any hint of kind of that the reason for migrating is an economic one reduces support. And what this work also found that sociotropic, economic, and cultural considerations also matter to an extent. So if you look at the bottom here, is that being a Muslim asylum seeker, religion reduces support relative to Christian asylum seekers. Some other research that I've been involved, and colleagues at the Migration Policy Center have been involved in, has looked at how Europeans feel about migration policies in general. Again, I won't go into detail. These are different policy dimensions. But basically what this research has shown, I think, is that I don't think there's evidence that Europeans want to get rid of the asylum systems, but there is evidence that there's stronger demand for control. So if you see there on the first direction, again, compared to a policy package that has no limits on asylum, there's a preference for having annual limits for asylum. If you look at family reunification, the fourth category here, compared to it being always possible for refugees, there's a preference for conditioning family reunification on being able to pay for the incoming family member. Completely denying family reunification is never possible here, actually reduces support. Okay? So one interesting finding here as well, we asked to what extent does EU centralization matter for public support for asylum system, and that reduces support. I won't go through this in the interest of time, but we've done some more work on public support for the EU-Turkey deal, and broadly we find that voters in Germany, Greece, and Turkey are broadly supportive of most dimensions, actually, of the EU-Turkey cooperations with few exceptions. So in a way, if one was to summarize some of this, this is a personal summary. If you think about public attitudes and preferences as some sort of soft feasibility constraint on policy making, if that's how you look at it, as I would look at it, then I would say that there was no evidence. I don't see any evidence in existing research that Europeans want to end asylum, as some European countries have proposed to do, notably Austria and Denmark. I don't see any evidence for support for pushbacks. I didn't talk about this, but in our research, so in the EU-Turkey deal, people do not prefer policies where Greece basically sends back any irregular migrant or any migrant arriving on the Greek shores without first checking their asylum claims. So we don't see evidence for pushbacks. But as I said, there seems to be a clear demand for more policy controls and conditionalities, particularly in the asylum system. And so what's the implication in a way? Well, I would argue one implication is that maybe to make the policy more sustainable, you need to shift the balance. This is where I come back to where I started. You try to shift the balance from asylum to resettlement. Because resettlement it's more under control, it's less volatile, the numbers are more limited. I mean, that would have been my kind of take on what needs to be done going forward before Ukraine. In terms of EU policy realities, as I said, there was very little progress, and I would have said actually very unlikely in the near future, looking at debates in recent years. Now, then of course we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and very quickly European Union activated the Temporary Protection Directive that was initially introduced in 2001 following the refugee flows from former Yugoslavia, but it has never been activated. This is the first time that this has been activated, and we've seen over 5 million refugees from the Ukraine, and 1.2 million in Poland, just under 400,000 Czech Republic, and 130,000 in Italy. So we have a large number of refugees who are now who do not need to go through the asylum process, right? Who are being essentially given protection status, and who are given all these rights that are listed here. So actually, one explicit point of if you read why the Temporary Protection Directive was introduced in the first place was to spare countries the countries that are experiencing mass influxes, spare them the burden of having to deal with this mass influx through the asylum system, because these numbers would mostly overwhelm most countries' asylum systems. But of course, what I would actually argue is that by avoiding the asylum issue, in a way, you also avoid questions about legitimacy, about deservingness, and in some ways also about control, I would argue. So I think it's had a positive impact. It's not surprising, I think, that this has had a positive impact, I think, on attitudes as well. We can talk about who's eligible. I'll just skip this. So I suppose one question, this is where the reflections begin. And we can talk about this. These are just some very quick thoughts. Why the different response? Why was it that this directive was activated now and not before? Well, I think one fairly obvious point is that, in many ways you could say that this issue is not being talked about as a refugee crisis, a refugee issue. It's really kind of, the geopolitical framing is different. This is about Europe being supportive of Ukraine. There are a number of geopolitical reasons why Europe is behaving the way it does toward people fleeing war in Ukraine. So it's not been framed or introduced as a refugee issue. Now, the second one I would say is that, the alternatives would have been really a little bit difficult to think about. Containment of such large numbers on the borders of Europe, I think would have been just very hard. It's one thing to say you contain people in the Middle East or even in Turkey or somewhere else, but here, you have a long land border with the European Union. I don't think the EU had too many options, really. There's been some discussion to what extent we should be surprised that public attitudes to to Ukrainian refugees have been so positive. And so I'd encourage you to read, again, a blog post written by Lenka Drasanova, the MPC, who basically suggests that maybe we shouldn't be so surprised if you think about what we know about the determinants of attitudes. Because Ukrainian refugees have many favorable characteristics that make it more likely that they will be accepted. There's a familiarity, there's by and large no security threat. We're talking about high shares of women and children. And of course, there's little discussion about deservingness because we're all witnessing the invasion. I think the other point that's sometimes being forgotten is that this is a temporary protection directive. Okay, so we're talking about temporary protection, 1 or maybe 2 years. So I think we can't quite directly compare that to the Geneva refugee status, because the big question, of course, with the current situation is what will happen after the 2 years, and we know what happened with the former war, with the war in former Yugoslavia, where we had similar situation. You had temporary protection. Some people returned, mainly the people from Kosovo, because it was possible to return, and people from Bosnia often did not return, because of course the situation in Bosnia was much more difficult. So what happens when, say, when some Ukrainian refugees do not return is an interesting question, I think. And I think there are important questions to be asked to what extent this will last. And at the MPC, we are starting a refugee policy track where we're basically trying to track what member states are doing with regard to their obligations under the Temporary Protection Directive. And I would personally expect some significant divergence over time. So at the moment, most countries, I imagine, are doing most of the things required under the Temporary Protection Directive, but this will change over time, and I think it's interesting. Now, I'll have 5 more minutes, I think, then 3 more minutes, and then I'll finish. Colleagues at the Migration Policy, and Andrew Geddes, who's here, and Lenka Trasanova, have also been involved in new research on attitudes, and we've just had the first results of new work on attitudes to refugees from the Ukraine in 8 countries in Europe, and basically, as we say here, that this work can find strong support for welcoming Ukrainian refugees, and maybe unsurprisingly, cooler attitudes toward refugees from other countries. Of course, I think one question is what exactly determines these differences. To what extent can these differences in attitudes be explained by what we know about the determinants of attitudes to migration and migration? So again, we can come back to this. So if you look at this, should we allow Ukrainian refugees? There's a lot of support for allowing at least some, and also many, but there is, I would say, still quite some country differences. Less support for allowing Syrian refugees, particularly in some of the East European countries included here. And there's also some data to what extent people think there's a moral view to European refugees. Again, I think quite some differences across countries, I would say. So I think these kind of data, to me at least, suggest is that there is certainly potential for divergence, for differences in the EU that maybe suggest a different picture than we currently hear about this apparent strong solidarity among EU countries as well. So this is my last slide. So what does it all mean? And again, this is just preliminary. And in the policy debate, people are basically asking themselves, so will this mean, will this in some ways, unexpected solidarity and welcome response to refugees from Ukraine, does that mean that things will get better in policy making toward refugees from other countries as well? So this is one kind of positive scenario. The negative scenario is that exactly the opposite will happen, namely that partly because of the large inflow, there will eventually be debates about effect, economic and social costs, and this will actually have negative spillover effects for refugees from other countries. So there might be even more pressure on asylum and resettlement, and more divergence. And in terms of some of the research questions, I mean, that's exactly what we can discuss here in the conversation as well. I think I'd be interested in finding out if there's that divergence over time and why, how does this develop and why, and as I said, how can we explain some of the public attitudes that we see now, the differences across groups of migrants, but also across member states and over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Excellent overview and excellent discussion points already. But before we get there, it's over to Jelena online. You don't need to share slides, is that correct?
Yes, I will just be speaking. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Daniela, for inviting me to this event. I would have loved to actually be able to join you there in Skifanoia, but since that's not possible, I'm very happy to join this quite full Zoom room if you wish. Now, the thing that I'm fascinated by is the relevance of this topic. And I think that what has been achieved with the seminar series are the discussions of the different kinds of implications that the war in Ukraine has had on the governance and politics in Europe. So as you'll see in a couple of minutes, following in this vein, Martin and I, in a way, look at the issues related to migration, but we do so by looking at some diametrically opposite ends of the migration spectrums. So you've heard from Martin about the implications of the Ukraine conflict on the most vulnerable migrants, so those fleeing conflict to save their lives. My research, by contrast, focuses on those who are, in a way, the least vulnerable ones in the context of migration. So I look at the ultra-high net worth individuals and the regulation of their migration and mobility. And this has also come into spotlight as a result of the Ukraine conflict, yet in a completely different way, as you will see in a minute. So just to give you a bit of background, there are three ways in which these high net worth individuals, or the rich, as we might refer to them colloquially, can obtain citizenship and residence rights in the European Union. One way is to obtain a passport through discretionary policies that allow states to naturalize individuals on the basis of national interest, and this interest is then articulated in economic terms. So if someone makes a huge contribution to a country's economy, then they can essentially become the country's citizen without meeting the substantive naturalization conditions. The second way is to obtain passport through special programs that essentially determine how much one needs to invest to get a passport of a particular country, under what conditions, in what types of investment need to be made, what checks and other criteria these people have to meet. Conditions for this kind of programs are normally waived, and there are no substantive conditions for naturalization. So these so-called passports for sale programs exist, or the golden passports, as media frequently refer to them, existed in three member states, so Malta, Cyprus, and Bulgaria, where for the amounts that ranged between 1 million and 3 million euros at different points in time since 2013, an investor was able to effectively obtain passports or purchase passports in those countries with very little connections to either of these three member states, yet with all the benefits that come along with EU citizenship. The third way was for investors to obtain temporary or permanent residence rights on the basis of investment. And this would in a way be a route to citizenship, which investors may or may not be willing to take. And what has happened since 2013 was that there has been a mushrooming of these investor residence programs across the European Union, but the approaches among the different member states as to whether what kind of residency rights the investors would obtain, the investment amounts, the time that they had to spend on the member state soil differed quite significantly. So there was no policy convergence across the UK. So these programs over the last 15 years have attracted a large number of wealthy third country nationals, mostly from the developing countries, to either settle in the EU, which was commonly done through these residence by investment policies, or to use the mobility rights afforded by EU passports to, in a way, access different countries, or to travel, or to access the financial institutions of the European Union. Now, As of 2015, 2016, these programs have been subject of a lot of public debates. And why? The case in point is that they have raised serious issues in Europe's government. So just to give you a couple of examples related to each of the different types of residence and citizenship for sale passports. In Austria, a Russian oligarch sought to bribe a local politician and promised to donate to the politician's party in exchange for a country's passport on the basis of discretion. In Malta, the former Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, resigned over the death of a journalist who was investigating the IIP in the country, but also the chief of staff of Muscat had previously resigned over a corruption scandal related to the immigrant investor program in Malta. In Cyprus, there have been continuous controversies over who was naturalized since 2014, because as the recent report of Al Jazeera has unpacked, a lot of politically exposed persons and individuals presenting security risks in different countries have been able to obtain passports of Cyprus on the basis of investment, and the situation in Bulgaria was not much different. In terms of the residence-based programs, similar scandals involving money laundering, corruption of high politicians have emerged in Portugal, which saw the resignation of a series of ministers over the so-called golden visa program, and the case of Hungary, which showed high levels of political corruption. The second reason why these programs, at least within the European Union, have proven, and especially in the context of the conflict in Ukraine, to be controversial, is the structure of beneficiaries. As the recent DPRS report has shown, if we look at the allocation of citizenship by investment across the board in the European Union, roughly 15% of applicants would come from China, around 10% from the Middle East and North African countries, 25% from the rest of the world, and around 50% of applicants would come from Russia. So this is, in a way, the general picture of what has been there before the conflict in Ukraine started. And obviously, in this context, the EU's approach has not been uniform, especially in the context of citizenship by investment. So the member states themselves insisted on the sovereign prerogatives of the state to decide on whom it wants as its member. At the same time, the European institutions, the European Commission and the Parliament expressed their reservations and their objections to these programs. However, they had little to none actual power towards phasing these programs out across the different member states. They had taken different initiatives, including the 2019 report of the European Commission on the investor and residence schemes in the European Union, which, amongst other things, highlighted the various governance issues and proposed certain steps to be taken, but also the 2020 infringement proceedings against Malta and Cyprus. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that the developments at the EU level have been rather slow. However, the conflict in Ukraine has provided a framework for, in a way, a more cohesive common approach towards the sales of passports and residence permits across the European Union's member states. So essentially, mere 2 days after the start of the conflict, on the 26th of February, in a joint statement, the European Commission, together with the governments of France, Germany, and Italy, but also including Canada, the UK, and the US, committed to take measures to limit the sale of citizenship. And one of the reasons that have been cited for this limitation was that these so-called golden passports would allow the wealthy Russians who are close to Putin to access these countries' financial systems, but not only, but to access also the protection that having the passports of these countries, citizenship of these countries would also allow. So in the subsequent weeks, a lot of developments happened within the European Union that in a way show this move towards phasing out investor citizenship and regulating better the investor residence program. So on the 2nd of March, Malta, which was in a way the country that was most active also in selling and promoting its passport to foreign investors, has suspended processing of Russian and Belarusian applications. On the 24th of March, Bulgaria completely abolished its program, which I found extremely interesting because following the publication of the 2019 report, Bulgaria had tried several times to make changes to its Citizenship Act, but it had never, before the 24th of March, abolished completely its investor citizenship program. There have also been different developments at the European level. So also on the 9th of March, the European Parliament directed a resolution, adopted a resolution in a way to urge member states to stop the sale of passports and to essentially revisit the passports that have already been granted to certain Russian nationals who have been placed on the sanctions list. It also required or asked from the member states to assess possibilities under national law to try and see whether the rights of those citizens who have been close to Putin's regime or connected to Putin's regime could be restricted or withdrawn. And perhaps the most interesting development and the concrete procedures for the withdrawal of these passports has happened in Cyprus on the 7th of April after an address to the Cypriot parliament by the Ukrainian President Zelensky. The country has initiated the revocation procedure of 4 passports that have been granted to Russian nationals and who have been on the EU sanctions list. In this case, Cyprus has not changed its legislation, but has rather decided to implement a clause in the existing provisions that enable the Cypriot government to make a withdrawal of citizenship to those who have been placed on the EU's sanction list. Now, what does all of this mean? Now, if we think about the context of the wealth-based migration, which, as you could, I hope, see from my brief talk, is very different from the need-based mobility, we have seen that there has been little convergence in the approaches taken by the member states, which were strongly protecting their sovereignty in allocating or regulating these wealth-based migration and mobility. The EU's institutions had also a very, very weak role and powers in the context of this migration type. Now, what the conflict in Ukraine proved to be was a sort of a catalyst for approximating these different views into a more restrictive approach towards wealth-based migration, precisely due to risks that the beneficiaries of these programs essentially might entail, given their profiles and given the countries of origin and the possible political connections that they might have with the particularly problematic regimes in those countries. So I will leave it at this, and I'm very happy to address any issues or give more detail in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jelena. And we can now open the floor for questions, obviously, but more generally for comments. And also I would suggest links to other sessions that we had. I'm thinking in particular the sessions we had on party politics and European identity. Looking at Hans-Peter Krisi, who was one of the leaders in that session, and we heard that there are links and papers that the Migration Policy Center has produced that also go in that direction. But the floor is open. Now, I'm not entirely sure I can monitor if there are questions from online. Maybe Sarah, from behind the screen, you can find a way to let us know if there are questions.
Of course, Daniele, what I'll do is I'll flag them for you, and then if necessary, read them out loud.
Very useful. Thank you. So the floor is open. So we start with Andrew.
Thanks very much. Two great talks. I think it's more a question from Martin, but perhaps also for Jelena, because I suppose it's thinking about what the role of the EU is in all of this. Because it seems to me, as somebody who studies EU migration, that it's the member states where all the action is, putting it quite crudely. I think Jelena kind of also demonstrated that. And the reason for that is that the core business of migration policy is admissions, and that's a matter for the member states. So whether it's resettlement or asylum or labour migration or family migration, these are essentially the competence of the member states. And the EU's role is more in terms of coordination and approximation. So that seems then to mean that what we had pre-Ukraine were negative internal trade-offs, because the absence of EU competence meant that individual migration policies within member states could have negative effects on other member states, both in terms of EU mobility and also recruitment of non-EU workers or non-EU nationals. And also a very significant external negative effect, because the EU itself, through its external action, is effectively unable to make any kind of offer, say, to African countries on admission, because that remains a matter of the member states. So pre-Ukraine, that seemed to me that to be the situation which fundamentally derives from this issue of admissions. What the Temporary Protection Directive does is absolutely go straight to the heart of this issue of admission, because it gives people fleeing Ukrainian conflict the right to enter an EU member state and move freely within the EU. And so maybe going to, I think Martin raised this point about convergence and divergence. I wonder if what we may see, maybe as a kind of direct question to Martin, is limited convergence around Ukrainians, but actually at the expense of wider divergence, in particular in relation to this external dimension of policy, because it seems to me highly unlikely that any external offer is going to be made to African countries on legal pathways in the face of displacement of 5 million people from Ukraine. So I wonder to the extent to which you think there could be limited convergence, but actually pressure, quite significant divergence, continued divergence in other areas, precisely because this called kind of this issue of admissions. Thanks.
Thank you. Martin, Jelena, would you like to react?
You want to go first, Jelena? Or I suppose the question was really
I mean, if you want to go first, then I can follow up, because the most of it was directed.
Okay. Yeah. No, I mean, I think I would broadly agree with that assessment, and it is. I think it's totally correct to the way Andrew described it. That the fundamental problem the European Union has had, in particular in discussions with non-EU countries and partnerships, is that the EU has essentially very limited to no competence on, in particular, the admission of labour migrants. And when the European Union talks in particular to African transit and origin countries, so there's different dimensions to this cooperation. One is obviously money for development. The other aspect is return and readmission. Europe wants more African countries to take back migrants who have irregular status here. But one big ask on the side of many African countries is that Europe opens up legal pathways, including labor migration pathways, including for lower skilled workers. And if you read initiatives of the past 20 years, I mean, the words are always there, but there's been no action. There's been a few pilot programs that the EU has supported. So there's a few hundred IT specialists from, I don't know, Morocco maybe, or in Belgium. And I think these pilot programs are good, but the problem is scalability. So I think from the African perspective, the EU lacks credibility in making any sort of offer in terms of opening up. And as Andrew said, I think this has created a real problem. Now the question now is, it's true obviously that we have not much more EU involvement now, but the question is whether that actually will remain to be the case. So after 2 years, when the Temporary Protection Directive finishes, it'll be interesting to see what the EU position is when if some countries, for example, say that, well, no, now we expect refugees to return, what is going to be the EU position, and how will countries feel about an EU position encouraging them to do X, Y, or Z? So I think I would broadly agree, and I would also agree that I think the negative scenario with regard to policies toward migrants from other parts of the world is a much more likely scenario here. I think there's going to be more pressure and potentially also, I think, more divergence.
Thank you. I don't know, Jelena, would you like to rejoin?
Yes, just briefly, I essentially agree quite with everything that Andrew has said, and it's very similar, if not even more pronounced in the domain of citizenship. But I think also the fact that there has been a resolution and a joint statement of the European Commission officials and the member states regarding the investor citizenship and residence programs shows that there is some convergence in this domain. Well, we're yet to see the long-term effects of this and the long-term effects on the crisis in Ukraine. What seems to me to be happening at the EU level is that the EU is taking a role of, if you wish, is taking up some risk management or a role of trying to do some damage control by these by these programs in relation to potential economic risks, meaning risks are related to financial fraud through the Anti-Money Laundering Directive, risks related to security, which is obviously related to the security profiles of individuals coming from particular countries that have been targeted by this new uniform approach, and the risks that are related to connections with Putin's regime in the context of politically exposed persons who have exceeded the rights of European citizenship and residence through investment. So I think that this is where this convergence, to me at least, seems to be going after a couple of months of crisis. So in a way, risk management and damage control.
Thank you. Adrienne Ritier is next, and then Hans-Peter Krisi. That microphone,
No, it's still very hard to hear. Could you use the one on the other side?
Try the other one. Sorry.
Nope. Third time is a charm.
Does it work now? Yes. Does it work? Yes.
Yes.
Yes. My question is to Martin. There was a program of the Commission starting early this year that they offered incentives to member states taking refugees from Afghanistan, and not only Afghanistan. I think 70 euros per refugee that you take on by member states. And I just want to know, do you have some information how this kind of step has developed? Was it successful as kind of a type of European measure in this area? And the question to Jelena is, it's very interesting that you said you do research on both asylum policy and buying passports or citizenship by investment policies. And my question was, but there is no kind of link really between the two policies. It's not, if you do one more, you have less of the other. So in a way, the link is only now a change in attitude through the war in Ukraine. But there is no real logical link between the two types of policies. Or don't I see that correctly?
Could you please pass that microphone to Hans-Peter? Thank you.
Yeah, I want to ask Martin about the resettlement policy, because if I understood you correctly, you want to see more of resettlement, but it's no accident that it didn't take place so far. I mean, you showed yourself in the beginning, it is totally insignificant. And according to our surveys, which we did in last year, 2021, so before the Ukraine crisis, this is really the most detested policy in Europe. It's a total no-go. You cannot do resettlement. We ask quotas. Now, I think the interesting thing in the Ukraine crisis is that resettlement took place automatically. So the refugees resettled themselves without the intervention of any political agent. If you do resettlement by quota or by intervention of international agents or supranational agents, it will not be accepted. Interestingly, Poland refused to accept resettlement policies. I mean, there was a debate, and Poland, on principle, although it would enormously benefit right now, it refused such policy arrangements because in the past they refused, now they refuse, and Eastern Europeans generally refuse such policy. So I wonder why you so much point to resettlement. And I would like to ask you whether you think that resettlement by civil society intervention, not by policy, would be a possibility, as we have seen now with the Ukraine.
Thank you both for your points. Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. I'll start with Hans-Peter's points. Just to be, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about that. I'm not sure if your question is so when I talk about resettlement, I mean resettlement of refugees from outside the European Union. I'm not talking about relocation of people who have already arrived in Europe and within. So this, I agree with you. I mean, this is on my slide was that these debates have gone nowhere. This kind of distribution of refugees within Europe has proved highly contested. And that. Now I'm talking about resettlement of refugees in Turkey, in Jordan, in Lebanon, who have recognized refugee status already, who are then being taken to high-income countries. This is what's generally referred to by the use of the term resettlement. Now, why do I say that it would be desirable, given the politics of my assessment of it, to have more resettlement? Well, precisely because I think quite a few of the aspects that make the asylum system so contested and problematic in some ways are not present with resettlement. First is this issue of deservingness. With the asylum system, you have to find out whether or not this person meets criteria. With resettlement, UNHCR has already decided that this person is a refugee. They're in Turkey, they're in Jordan, in Lebanon, they have refugee status, so there's no question about, there's no assessment process anymore. So this is servingness. There's complete control in terms of numbers, because Italy, Germany, Sweden can decide this year we're going to resettle 10,000 and no more, 5,000, 20,000. There's no volatility in the numbers. And so for those reasons, there's much more control. So for those reasons, I think, but I will concede one point. Well, so theoretically, I think that there is reason to believe that resettlement should be much more popular than asylum. Now, the obvious question is, I think you're right to ask, why have we not seen more resettlement? And I know that some of my colleagues who know much more about attitudes to immigration to me say, Martin, you're naive, thinking that people differentiate between asylum seekers and, they like migrants or they don't like migrants, they have these views. But I think that given the research that I've been involved in, this issue of volatility, the issue of control, and the issue of deservingness do matter for preferences. And I would think that, if 2015-16 crisis, Germany had decided to take 1 million in resettlement, as opposed to letting people come and apply for asylum, that I think would have been a more controlled process, and that might have had a more positive impact on attitude. So that's why I'm asking for resettlement. So yes, there is also private resettlement. Has traditionally been a government business. There is now also private actors are getting involved in resettlement. So basically, church communities or other communities are offering to fund. I think especially in Canada, this has been quite popular. I think that there are some questions that are being asked about that as well, because obviously one question is about the selection, because particular church communities are selecting particular refugees. So I think there's a question about who is most deserving of being resettled. Is it people with particular religion, because they're being involved as private actors? So I think that's a question. In response to Adrienne, so I don't know the specifics about the program that you've mentioned on Afghanistan, but I think the broader question, of course, is how do you encourage countries to accept asylum seekers who the European Union thinks, in a way, there should be some acceptance. And that goes back in a way to relocations. I don't want to confuse the issues, but debates are essentially, before we had the solidarity with Ukraine, we talked about flexible solidarity among EU member states. Because of that, some countries refuse to be solidaristic. So then the question was, okay, let's be flexible. If you don't want to take refugees, then maybe you should pay. You should, so the countries that accept refugees, maybe they should be subsidized by the European Union. And the countries that don't take refugees, they pay in. So there are all kinds of proposals on the table about how to make these systems work, and the financial incentives are a part of that. But so far, I think none of this has, as far as I understand. But I don't know about the Afghanistan program.
Jelena?
Yes, thank you very much, Adrienne. I struggled a little bit to hear, but if I understood well, you were saying that the asylum policies and investor-related migration are at the very two opposite ends, and that there's nothing connecting them in this context, apart from the fact that there has been some sort of a change. Now, my own research has been more on the investor citizenship and residence-based programs over the past decade. In the past, I had looked at the refugee and asylum policies related to the former Yugoslavia, but also in more recent times, I've edited a working paper on vulnerable mobilities together with Rainer Babok. Now, if we think about policies themselves, indeed, the conflict in Ukraine has sparked a change. And I think that if we take into account what Andrew has said before, that there has been very little conversion at the European level, having something that has made a change, I think, is an important thing and an important factor to consider in the future research on migration and migration in different contexts. But I think that this change essentially speaks quite well to what Martin Ruhs was saying a little bit ago, but also to the broader question of European identity, because we see by these policy shifts, one is who are those who are seen as deserving or desirable as migrants in the European context. And I think that this is a hugely important question that has come into play at the European level, and not only at the very practical policy level, which is where you can actually measure it, but also at a more conceptual level, considering what Europe is and who European citizens are. So I'll leave it at that and happy to follow up.
Okay, thank you, Jelena. So, Martin? So, Martin, you go first.
Yeah, thanks, Daniele. I had a question about counterfactuals in relation to EU policy making. Do EU policies really make a difference? Right? And on the Temporary Protection Directive, I realized that this has been there already for so long, I don't know, almost 20 years, and now it's the first time that it has been applied, so it's a new thing, but I'm not so sure if it really makes such a big difference in comparison to what member states were doing in the absence of EU policy making in the Syrian refugee crisis. Right? When you think about the alternative, it's basically that member states, also in the Syrian case, they actually very quickly said there is clearly a conflict there. We give Syrians who apply for asylum temporary protection. We cannot send them back, so they get some kind of nationally oriented temporary protection status, right? That was basically the default. That, of course, would give people in member states the right to stay there, and often after a certain time, it would give them some rights to work. The EU Temporary Protection Directive doesn't really add that much from my perspective, in the sense that it gives some free movement, but of course it doesn't give you the right to move to another member state and work there. Right? So the protection needs to be transferred to the other member state, and then you can work there. But as far as I understand, the Temporary Protection Directive gives you the right to work in the member state where you have temporary protection. And so, in that sense, I would say that it's still limited. Now, my second question to Martin on this is, what does this say about theorizing about EU policy making in the field of asylum? Right? Actually, I think this field has been a bit stuck in all kinds of political problems, relations of between member states, between more functional approaches, dealing with negative externalities, like Andrew was already referring to, and more intergovernmental approaches. And the main thing, in as far as something did happen at the EU level, seems to be the regional element, right? The fact that we have the conflict in the region, so the neighborhood. And in that sense, it's interesting to recall that the Temporary Protection Directive, I think it came up in the context of the Kosovo conflict, so that's something apparently specific, which I don't think is fully appreciated in theorizing about EU policy making. And so maybe, Martin, your thoughts on this. And to Jelena, the same question about the counterfactual, right? So because the EU, I realized that some of the discussions on citizenship for sale and residency for sale changed, but of course the main problem is related to assets and the seizing of assets, and to that extent, citizenship is a problem in the sense that it makes seizing of assets by people linked with the Putin regime is more difficult. But I don't see a fundamental change in the EU policy on changing competence, right? The key question of this citizenship by investment is still competence, and you know, every week that you open The Economist or the Financial Times, there's still the advertisement from Malta and Cyprus and Montenegro, as you know well, you know, buy our beautiful citizenship and become an EU citizen. So in that sense, yeah, I don't see that much change. Portugal, a country that I know well, of course, there were some changes, especially related to Abramovich, who had become Portuguese citizen. And the Russian conflict made the Portuguese authorities look again into that case, discovered basically fraudulent acquisition for, you know, the synagogue in Porto was very proactive apparently in the liaising between the demand and the supply side, and for quite some time the Portuguese authorities were happy to condone that, and now with the conflict they have become more critical, right? But I don't see this as a result of EU policy making, but rather a result of, let's say, the conflict as such, and the fact that it is in the neighborhood, and that we look specifically at the Ukrainians and therefore also Russians, and therefore society, and also puts pressure on governments. But I don't see this, let's say, changing paradigm in as far as it is strongly linked to EU policy making.
Thanks, Martin. Bruno?
It's the one that works, I think. Sort of. It's a question for a curiosity question for Martin. So this influx of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians in different countries, what have been the short-term effects in terms of labor, access to the labor market? So do we have already some evidence on how easily Ukrainians have acceded to the labor markets? And conversely, to what extent have they put pressure on asylum reception centers? Because that's what many people expected, is that the existing asylum reception conditions in European countries might be put under further pressure with Ukrainians. But I haven't heard much about that. So I'm also wondering whether there's any evidence there about this phenomenon happening, and whether there may be major differences between countries in both respects, in terms of access to the labor market and in terms of pressure on asylum reception conditions.
Maybe we collect one more, or maybe it's time for you to respond to these points.
Jelena, do you want to go first this time?
Sure, no problems. When it comes to counterfactuals, which is something that Martin mentioned, I think that within the policy domain of citizenship and migration, and Martin, you know that as well as I do, there's only so much that the EU can do in terms of its actual competencies, and especially in the context of the allocation of citizenship, giving competence to the EU would to actually regulate anything related to citizenship acquisition would need a treaty change, and let's put it like this: any treaty revision at this point is highly unlikely. So I think that we would need to have, and I'm trying to have realistic expectations as to what can be done at the EU level in the context of investment-based migration, and in the context of the actual competences of the European Union. And you know that most of the actions that have been proposed also in the context of the Ukraine conflict have been related to either the single market or have been related to issues that are connected to security. However, I think that looking at those small points of convergence can tell us a lot. Can tell us a lot about the powers that the EU has to either directly or indirectly influence certain policy domains. Now, if you're asking me whether Cyprus, Malta, Bulgaria would have abolished their programs regardless of the joint statements of the EU that's something I can't reply because I think it would be quite a lot of speculation. But I think that the combination of the infringement procedures, continuous emphasis on the risks that these programs entail, and the emphasis on due diligence and checks on the sources of funding have essentially led to some sort of convergence among the countries, at least, who have been offering passports in exchange for investment, to abolish these programs, not completely, because as you may as well know, they still have some programs, but these are mostly they've been transforming, in a way, citizenship by investment into some sort of residency by investment. But this is related to the dynamics of the market as well. But I think in the domain of the so-called sales of passports, this little convergence has, in a way, if not been directly caused by the EU's activities, then it has been pushed in a certain direction. But I might be wrong. It may have happened on its own without any of the EU's involvement, just because of the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah, thank you. I'll go in reverse order. On the question on pressure on asylum system. So there's not meant to be any pressure on the asylum system itself, because the process, there is no asylum process. That was my point, is that through the Temporary Protection Directive, people don't have to go. Now, of course, if what you're referring to, there might be pressures in terms of making meaningful all these rights that the Temporary Protection Directive requires in terms of Ukrainian refugees' access to them. And I think, yes, you would expect there to be a range of pressures, not least because if you look at these rights, I mean, some of them essentially put refugees not a million miles away from kind of rights that actually EU nationals enjoy with regard to the welfare state. So they're supposed to get access to welfare state, access to social assistance, access to child benefits, access to school. So you can expect all kinds of pressures in general, but not on the asylum system as such. Now, the asylum question is relevant because, of course, what happens if some of the refugees from Ukraine apply for asylum? So I think the Temporary Protection Directive has something to say about that. I've actually forgotten what, but I mean, that's a key question, because one way in which somebody might, if this is temporary, of course, what happens if somebody applies for asylum and then might get Geneva status? So the asylum system may eventually be affected if, for example, at the end of temporary protection, people apply for asylum. So I think it's a good point. In terms of the access to the labor market, again, I mean, I'm not aware of any existing evidence of this. If you read the Temporary Protection Directive, there's an interesting aspect, actually. So in principle, it says it should have unrestricted access, but there's a clause in there, which is a little bit unusual, which basically says that unless it suggests that member states can perform what's called the labor market test, which usually applies to the admission of labor migrants. So when you talk about the admission of labor migrants from outside Europe, before an employer gets access to a work permit, they have to show that there's no worker available within the EU to do this job. That's kind of a labor market test. Now, on paper, this kind of mechanism is actually available within the Temporary Protection Directive as well. It seems difficult for me to understand how that could work in practice. So I would assume that refugees from Ukraine get access to almost all jobs without restriction. But yes, at some point, I mean, impact will start to show. Now, keeping in mind the characteristics, at the moment with high shares of women, high share of children, but at some point, I think you will see labor market impacts coming through. And I think the question then becomes, to what extent does the framing and thinking about this shift from a rights-based protection angle to a more consequentialist debate about costs and benefits? So at some point, people will start asking these kinds of questions. What are the impact on the labor market? What are the impact on the fiscal balance, for example? And then in response to Martin's point, so I think, again, the first one is a good question, but I would disagree quite strongly on this one. I do think there's a major difference. Yes, all EU member states have this facility to provide temporary protection, and many have done it. But as I've tried to argue, the big difference is that if there had not been a Temporary Protection Directive, you would have had similar processes. You would have had people coming in a very unregulated way, applying for asylum challenging the system, getting status, and typically the temporary protection statuses that we see are associated with far fewer rights than those associated with the Temporary Protection Directive. Temporary protection does not give all these rights that we've seen here as well. So that's been part of my argument. I think the advantage with this temporary protection has been that it has been controlled, as Hans-Peter said. It's almost been like resettlement, self-resettlement, in the sense that the European Union decided you have refugee status. So if you can come, you have refugee status. We're not asking questions about deservingness. We're not asking about what your impacts are, at least at this stage. So I think that in terms of public reception, I think it's made a big difference. But as I tried to argue, going forward, I think it's a legitimate question to ask in a way. I think going forward, some of these other questions about labor market impact on the fiscal balance will start to come through. But I do think that there was this, it had a big difference. In terms of theorizing, yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And if you think about the politics or policies of asylum essentially being about managing a tension between providing protection and the national interest and control, then I think what we're seeing now is that these kind of national interest considerations taking on a much bigger, so by national interest I mean kind of socio-economic, cultural, both political, they take on a much bigger geopolitical component. So if the national interest includes regional geopolitical concerns, I think that might have an impact on how policymaking proceeds on asylum in the future. And it might, I mean, if this is the kind of way we think about asylum in the future, it becomes much more regional issue. I mean, then we're also back in the kind of call your bets type of world where, so then questions are being asked, where should refugees go? Who is responsible for refugees? Yes, Europe is responsible for refugees from Ukraine, but who is responsible for refugees from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan? So yeah, so I'll have to think more about it, obviously, but I think the regional element, how that affects these kinds of consequentialist impact considerations, and then how that feeds through how to manage the tension is managed is really interesting.
Maybe this works. Yeah. I have a question for Martin. Yeah. Thanks for your presentation. And I was reflecting a bit on this idea of resettlement, and especially this shift, like fostering resettlement instead of asylum. And my question is like, is there a risk in your opinion that there would be a shift, and that through this shift from asylum to resettlement would have, besides the intrinsic issues of immigrant selection, also the ultimate result of fostering externalization of migration management? And so in this case, more practical, like if you are a refugee, what should you do in order to be admitted to the EU? Because if it's not enough that you already like take a long journey just to be physically within the EU and then ask for asylum, then what are you supposed to do? Maybe to go to a detention center in Turkey and spend there a couple of years before someone selects you because you are like a proper immigrant that would be probably willing to integrate well within the EU system, while if you're not, if you're just a Muslim that wants to come to the EU from another country, African country, you're just not selected because of your origin and your background. Thanks.
Would you like to react immediately?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, but one thing to remember is that the kind of shift I'm proposing is that you would ramp up resettlement significantly. So anyway, the chances of being selected would increase drastically. I agree that selection becomes hugely important. So what you don't want is a lot of privately led sponsorship that is very selective in terms of picking particular people who might not, in any stretch of the imagination, be among the most vulnerable. So I think that's important. But I don't quite see. I'm in two minds about this whole debate about externalization. So if externalization is about keeping people out, then normatively, yes, I'm against that. But if externalization is about helping, providing support for refugees where they are, but at the same time also admitting refugees just in other ways, then I think the normative response is much more complicated. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, we can, for example, there's many things to criticize about the EU-Turkey deal, but there's no doubt that the money that the EU has spent in Turkey on education of refugee children in Turkey has had very beneficial benefits in Turkey. So one thing that I kind of object to normatively is this idea that any sort of financial assistance is cast as some sort of negative externalization policy. Yes, it could be part of that, and then we can have a discussion. But I think if you have a policy where you say you become more controlling of asylum, but much more generous on resettlement, and at the same time you provide countries with financial support, normatively speaking, I don't see why that is a worse situation than the current situation that we have now. If you also think about who I mean, it's a long debate, but if you think about who self-selects to make it to apply for asylum, I mean, who manages the trip across all these borders? I think that's also a relevant question. But I think that the main danger, this is the debate I've had with some, the Austrian government, where I've been involved a little bit, is I think the main danger with a lot of this is the sequencing. Is that, because basically what you're saying is that, more control of asylum, increased resettlement. And what many governments will do is to say, okay, we'll increase, if they increase resettlement, but first we've got to have the control. So it's always control first. So it's a bit like the immigration debate in the US as well, the kind of difference broadly between kind of comprehensive immigration reform, where you have control the border, reform the work permit system, and have legalization. And basically comprehensive reform arguments, we all do everything at the same time. And on the conservative side, people saying, no, we've got to do enforcement first. So the danger is that you will get the clampdown on the asylum system, but will not get the increase in resettlement. That's the political danger that I see. And in Austria, when I was involved, I made that argument precisely, that I said, look, you make all this, you have all these policies, which personally I disagree with, but you want to, say zero asylum. Why don't you at the same time increase resettlement? And people looked at me as if I had just dropped from Mars. And that's because they say, well, how can we increase resettlement when we've had so many asylum seekers? And I said, well, because, if there's any sort of, in my view, I would say if there's any sort of normative basis of what you do is then, if you, reduce the aspects of refugee protection that you find problematic, but at the same time find a better way, why don't you? But that's the danger, that people basically just say, we've had so many. And that is also explanation why Austria is still resettling very few people, because we've had so many asylum seekers, we can't possibly settle anybody. So I think the real danger is with that argument is the sequencing, that you'll get the enforcement, you'll get the restrictions, but you won't get the resettlement. And I think that is a big danger. That is a danger that I acknowledge. But it's not clear to me that more resettlement, less asylum is normatively worse than what we have now.
Jelena, do you want to add something to this?
No, I think this question was essentially directed to Martin, but I'm actually happy to see how, in a way, a discussion on how the conflict in Ukraine affects the different aspects of migration policies. And this is something that we will need to observe in the coming months.
Thanks. Couple of more points.
It was just a really quick thing in relation to what Adrian was talking about earlier with Afghans, because I was following this quite closely. And so is it, you were talking about a scheme where the EU funds Afghan refugees to move to the EU?
We can't hear.
Each member state taking a refugee from Afghanistan, but also from other countries, gets 70 euros per refugee. That was in February, March.
Okay, the reason that, because I'd never come across that, and because I know that in January there was a big package of aid for Afghanistan, which seemed like what Martin was just talking about, which is precisely designed to support displaced people from Afghanistan, in Iran, Pakistan, Central Asia, with the aim of stopping them moving to the EU. So I was kind of really intrigued by this. I didn't know about this kind of scheme, because I know that member states have made resettlement pledges sort of independently, to have committed to take certain numbers. I didn't know there was financial, and that's quite a significant thing. I didn't know about that.
I can look up the reference and just send it to you where I found it. Yeah.
Just a quick addition. I mean, I'd be interested in seeing that as well, but did you say 70? Yeah, so I've seen discussions about where we're talking about many thousands, because there's been big discussions about what's the cost of so 70 euro is not gonna, we're talking about many thousands, and the discussions that I've seen involve kind of much larger numbers. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
I'm sorry I missed up relocation and resettlement again, but nevertheless the two are linked. I wonder, let's say UNHCR clears 100,000 refugees. They are recognized refugees that can be resettled in the EU. How are they distributed across the member states?
So the suggestion I would make that it should not necessarily be EU competence. I mean, it's member states. I'm talking about member states. So it's a member states. I mean, there is now a very large number of refugees. I mean, as you know, 85% of the world's refugees are in low and middle income countries. So there's a very large number of refugees waiting to be resettled. And it's up to individual high income countries to decide how many they're going to resettle. So I think you're right that if this became a scheme where the EU says we take 200,000 each year, then again, we need to discuss where they go. And I think that kind of discussion would be just as contested as the relocation discussion. But the big difference between the resettlement that I have in mind is that member states can decide. With the reason why relocation within the EU is so contested is because there's a common policy on this. And this is being basically the EU telling particular countries how many refugees they're meant to take. With resettlement, this would not be the case because France, Germany, Italy could decide on their own every year. I mean, this is the current system anyway, how many they take. So I'm just suggesting increasing that number. There would be control, individual control of member states. And that's why it would be very different, I think. The dynamics would be very different. But as I said, it remains an interesting question, I think, why countries in Europe don't do much more resettlement.
So if I understand correctly, relocation is a EU competence, but not resettlement.
Well, competence in the sense that the EU has attempted to create policies that distribute asylum seekers. I mean, sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes people are asylum seekers, so who still need to be assessed, sometimes already recognized, who are already within Europe. And that essentially failed. And that was very contested. So they tried to do that, and that essentially failed.
Okay, thank you. So we reach the end of our session. I usually ask to summarize or conclude in some way, and I do that because I would like to know about the impact of the war on the European Union, whether it leads to more Europe or less Europe or the same Europe, very, very crudely. And I don't know, we had sessions where it was very clear, okay, we have more Europe, for example, on the financial session or the energy session or even the security, defense and security one. And somewhere it wasn't very clear. And here, I'm not sure. What I hear from you, it's basically the same. Not much of an impact on the European Union from this crisis. I mean, migration crisis, the war. I mean, the war. Is that a fair assessment of the impact?
Well, I would say, I mean, initially, I think there is clearly more Europe now because we've got the Temporary Protection Directive, which I think has had a meaningful and I think positive impact. And it's come about because of common EU policy action, which is very different. But I think it's an interesting case where actually more Europe now, we might see a little bit less Europe in the future. That's my point. I mean, it's more Europe now temporarily. It doesn't necessarily mean that this will remain to be the case, and that, as I said before, as temporary protection ends, I would say almost certainly you'll have again less Europe, which comes closely to the kind of level of Europe we have now when it comes to refugee policies toward other countries. But so maybe that's, I don't know, I'm not an expert on European integration, but maybe that is an interesting factor that it might be an example of where you have more and then actually less again. So it's not a kind of a one-way system. It's not necessarily where you have these kind of institutional path dependencies that kick in, and then you say, no, we have created these structures and this is how it's going to go. I think also the data that come out of Andrew and Lenka's survey suggests that there are some fragilities and under the system now that mean that it's not guaranteed that this more Europe will remain.
Jelena, maybe the last word to you. I was really fascinated by your account of how passports are handed out. I mean, I knew a bit from reading the newspaper, but this seems to me one of, I mean, Philip Genscher will speak of a core state power who becomes a member of a community. So the boundaries of a community seems to me quite fundamental, and that it's a competence that it's a strange thing. It's a competence left to member states, but then can be used across the whole of the European Union. So in terms of control, it's very, I can imagine that this is an area where more coordination will be necessary.
Yes, just to in a way link the two issues. The allocation of membership, as you rightly say, is a matter of the member states themselves. What has happened in the context of investor citizenship was that essentially the value added of EU citizenship rights has been annexed to the national passport. So what Malta and Cyprus and Bulgaria were selling essentially was not their national passports, but what comes on top of it with the EU. Now, this raises two fundamental questions in the context of whether there's going to be more Europe, less Europe, and the effect of the conflict on these programs. I think the baby steps, if you wish, that we have seen happening might, similar to what Martin was saying, might lead to a bit more Europe, but the long-term effects are yet to be seen. I don't think that there will be that this will lead to a major case of erosion of national sovereignty and attributing citizenship. So, but I think that this essentially these dynamics of having more Europe in some domains and less Europe in others, and also that this changes over time, in a way speaks about the European project as a sort of a work in progress, which can go one step forward and two steps back, and then in different directions. And I think that if we look at Europe as such, it can tell us a lot about also the questions of European citizenship, the questions of European identity, but also the questions that I think you have planned for one of the next sessions, which is the question of the future of Europe, what Europe will look like in 5, 10, 20 years. And this obviously is also related to the questions of EU enlargement. So I will leave it at that. So I wouldn't necessarily look at this as a binary, more and less Europe, but more and less Europe in a broader context. So what happens when? Thank you.
Very last point by Adrian.
Yes, relating to what Jelena said, the discussion about Montenegro and its 600,000 population, kind of letting in a lot of Chinese citizens as Montenegro citizens, and keeping then unanimity, of course, would have huge implications as regards future development of the European Union as an institution, as a polity.
Thank you.
I'm from Montenegro originally, Adrian, so thanks for mentioning that.
Very good. Thank you very much. First of all, to our two speakers, a really very engaging session. Thank you for your participation, both in the room and online. No questions came, but thank you for being with us. Next week, we have our last session, and it will be on enlargement. So I think it will relate very closely also to what has been said today. It will be introduced by Bridget Laffan, who is in Dublin. So we will have a session that will be only online. And we know how it works. It works. It's more pleasant to be in the room, but we know that it can work very well also online only. So I hope that many of you will be attending. Thank you very much and goodbye.